Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. Our webinar today about powering your ESG ambitions through data. This webinar is hosted by Juvo. Juvo is a professional service company specialized in data productivity improvement projects. Actually, what we do is we use data to make it profitable for our customers. Making profitable is going over profitability most of the times, but the last years we see a tendency that there's more than only profitability. There's also people and there's also planet. And that's where sustainability comes into place. This is why we organize this webinar, and we invited Deep Parekh to introduce sustainability and accordingly ESG, and to let us know how data can be used to also make data profitable for your ESG goals and your ESG ambitions. I will collect the questions during the webinar. You can enter them in the Q&A form. At the end, we will come back on it and we will answer the questions. Also, if there are some technical difficulties, please enter it in the Q&A form. But now, Deep, it's up to you. Welcome and good luck.
Super, thanks very much, Jan. Just to introduce myself a little bit, I am an advisor to senior leadership teams on sustainability around business strategy and operations. I am a partner at ESG, and we have deployed a number of initiatives with multinational supply chains. We're also developing a European think tank in this space, focusing on business transformation in ESG. I have a background in business modeling, and my work is focused at the intersection between ESG and technology. So great, let's get started. Thanks everyone for being here today. So let's quickly kick off with what is ESG, right? You might have heard the acronym around, you might have read it online a number of times. So ESG is an acronym that stands for environment, social, and governance. So governance is corporate governance as we have it. The environment part is basically, in a nutshell, being a steward of nature, right? Being a steward of renewable resources and nature, and the social element is about being at benefit of all the stakeholders. So we used to live in a world where shareholders were of prime importance, and this has shifted over the last 8 or 10 years, where it's to the benefit of all stakeholders. And then the last part is around governance. So it's about the transparency and adequate internal controls to manage your business effectively and based on the principles that are being outlined in ESG. So ESG refers to a holistic set of factors by which to manage a business, and we'll dive into those in a little bit more detail. And it basically means that we need some broad principles by which to operate your business. Increasingly, ESG factors are also being used in terms of compliance, screening, evaluation by multiple stakeholders of your business. So all of a sudden, ESG seems to be starting to take down the walls around your company and start becoming more exposed to the outside world to show them what you have and show them what you're doing. And that's what the world is looking for. So let's talk about what ESG actually covers, right? So ESG covers, of course, the environment part, but includes not only your emissions that are more directly out of your operations, but also the indirect emissions that are emitted from you and from the business activities that are conducted. It's not just about pollution, but it's also water utilization. It's about renewable resources. It's about ethical treatment of animals, and it's of course about natural resource conservation. In terms of society, we're quite familiar with initiatives like CSR, which talk about societal norms and ensuring that we have a direct and indirect impact on the society among us. But that includes not just the community, but also your employees, your customers, other stakeholders that are in the mix here. And it's in fact on the point where we want to the ESG factors encourage employees to be participants in this this perspective of the business in conducting operations in a more societal friendly manner. And of course, governance is always something that we need to look out for. So it includes not just all the usual sort of regulatory and compliance related work, but also ensuring that we don't indirectly influence politicians to make policies which might be harmful to the overall ecosystem. It also, it also needs to ensure that the board members avoid conflicts of choice or conflicts of interest in terms of conducting their leadership in the business that they're in. So this is sort of what ESG encompasses. As you can see, it's quite a wide range of things. And what you might intuitively understand is that you've seen some of these things before, and you quite likely have, because there have been a lot of different initiatives, disparate initiatives, which are attacking points of this ESG equation, so to speak, and they're addressing it in a point-like manner, but they're not holistic enough in nature. And so here's sort of where this whole thing fits into the overall loop, where you have global issues such as income inequality and social injustice, and all sorts of other issues, depressed communities, climate change, larger issues like this. And what we've had is so far specific solutions that start addressing a few of these particular issues in a more pointed and more direct manner. But it's not until recently where ESG has taken on that role of that holistic approach to viewing these particular factors and not addressing them in a point-like manner, but really addressing them more in an umbrella fashion across the board. And what's important is that ESG, it envelops enough of these topics to be able to give you the basis for delivering your United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs as they're called. And as you can see from this graphic, there's a very clear linear relationship between ESG enabling you to be delivering these SDGs, and the outcomes then become what outcomes are desired for the environment, for society, and for governance, all across the board. So essentially, ESG is a holistic approach by which you can deliver your sustainable development goals to achieve the outcomes that your business wants to achieve. Now, this is all very well and good, but is it urgent? Is it important? And in fact, the answer is it's both. Okay, it's gone beyond greenwashing. Greenwashing doesn't cut it anymore. What do I mean by greenwashing? Where companies start to put together a PR message or a marketing sort of communication which says, oh, look, we're doing a lot of things which are good for nature and society and all that. But it's now actually beginning to be quantified and regulated and managed in a much more rigorous manner. And so now it's time to take this this whole notion of compliance and risk management far more urgently than we might have before, in terms of parameters that we might not have looked at. In terms of importance, you can see over the last 9 or 10 years, ESG, the amount of assets under management have crept up from a few billion to over 80 trillion US dollars. And so this is clearly something that's being taken quite seriously across the world in financial markets and in operational roles and enterprises like yours. So ESG as a nature is both urgent and important and needs to be addressed now. We're going to do a little bit of a survey, a very quick little survey, to understand that in your organization, just to kind of keep it a little bit more interactive, in your organization, is ESG regarded as urgent, important, both, or neither? And you can choose one of these just to get a better understanding of where you're at as an audience. So I think we're going to open the polls right now, Jan. Yeah, perfect. So the polls are open, and you can choose what your responses are. Perfect. We'll give it 5 or 10 seconds more. And if you've got a decent number of responses, Jan, we can maybe close the poll. Perfect. Maybe Jan can share with us what we looked at. Perfect. So what we see is something like 63% of you have raised the issue of ESG as important, but it's not quite urgent yet in your organization. So really good insight from our part. And so we want to create that sense of urgency as well, so that and we'll show you during this webinar as to why it's also an urgent view of things. Thanks very much. So let's talk about the burning platform. So why is this important right now? What's the burning platform? So we're at the nexus of three critical factors right now. One is that consumers are demanding much greater provenance transparency and sustainability from their favorite brands. They want their brands to have a purpose. They want the companies to have a purpose. And that's one very large factor that's only growing every day. The second is that authorities and regulators are rolling out new frameworks. So in Europe, for example, new frameworks such as the reporting framework called SDFR is being rolled out right now. It's effective January 2022, so which really doesn't give us a lot of time. And so we're seeing that from a regulatory perspective, it's going to become more and more urgent over the course of this year, that you start rolling out reporting and monitoring of your ESG factors sooner rather than later. And then the third factor is one that's quite visible in front of us. That's basically the financial markets. And what financial markets are doing increasingly is they're using ESG metrics to guide some of the key decision making around risk models and around other decisions that they need to make around interest rates, loans, etc. And so the financial markets are looking at ESG factors very closely as well. So we're really at this nexus between these three things. Just to illustrate my point a little bit, when we talk about consumers, we've seen articles in Forbes and Board Agenda and Motley Fool, etc., around the link between consumerism and ESG, having a soul in your consumerism and not just consuming blindly, but actually understanding what you're consuming and understanding what impact you're having in the market. It's also been shown by companies like Unilever that, for example, their sustainable living brands are growing 65% faster than the rest of their portfolio. And so companies like Unilever are starting to switch more and more brands to having purpose, to having these ESG factors built into the brand image and into the brand, not just image, but into the center of what that brand stands for and how it's made and how it's distributed and how it's consumed. Is the case. Now, one very important other factor is that based on this survey from IBM and the National Retail Foundation or National Retail Federation, they also found that consumers are willing to pay a higher price if the product that they're consuming and the company that they're consuming it from is doing the right thing. So people are willing to pay what's called a sustainability premium for products and services that they are choosing to consume. One such interesting example, and an example that really comes to the forefront, it's a pizza chain called Ann Pizza. And they take the S of ESG very seriously. So this is one of the first pizza chains that is paying their employees a living wage. So not minimum wage, but a living wage, so that the employee doesn't have to get a second job and a third job just in order to be able to support the family and be able to lead a quality of life that is reasonable. And the pizza costs more than the peer group of pizza that you're buying. But consumers are willing to pay more because they know where the money is going, and they want the employees of that pizza chain to have a more robust and fulfilling lifestyle. And so therefore, consumers are willing to pay that premium in order to consume this pizza. And employees obviously are more happy as a result as well. And this creates this great growth loop that can benefit both parties basically simultaneously. And in fact, just as a point of curiosity, in fact, some of the employees are so committed to Ann Pizza, they've even had Ann Pizza, actually the logo tattooed on their arms or some other body part that they've told this newspaper about, Bloomberg. So just to give you a sense, this is sort of where the consumer world is revolving around ESG. In terms of the regulatory world, in terms of the regulatory world, what we're seeing is that the EU is rolling out a 9-pillar framework. Now, there's a lot of detail in this, and of course, the slides will be sent out later for your availability to be able to view this at your leisure. But essentially, the key things are we want to avoid greenwashing. So there's a lot of companies who are out there who are trying to portray themselves as green and doing right for the environment or society or governance, but really it's just a veneer that they're painting, and it's quite easy to see through these things. And so they want to avoid greenwashing so that consumers are not misled as to the quality of product or the resources that they consume and how it's consumed. The other point that regulation is trying to achieve is some sort of neutrality, that we are trying to harmonize the rules across different companies so that everyone is being held to the same standards, right? And so that's going to be a big shift as well. And lastly, they want to level the playing field so that, you know, in terms of investment, they're looking at the similar things as other industries are looking at, and everyone's looking at the same set of rules, the same descriptions, the same sort of a taxonomy of what we consider as ESG and what counts and what does not count. So this is also something that's happening quite significantly within the next, call it 6 to 9 months, and we should see that rolled out quite quickly. And lastly, in terms of the finance world, they're using ESG metrics to evaluate companies' risks. So you have, you know, companies like Goldman Sachs is making ESG finance, a core part of their strategy. You have BlackRock and other such companies. They're putting pressure on companies that are either polluting or not using sufficiently renewable resource or whatever into doing more good for the environment. So they're using the carrot and stick approach of finance in order to pressure companies into doing the right thing. Now, one of the other things I wanted to show here on the top left corner is this company. It's a packaging company in Spain called Caribou, and this is an interesting company because why I put this on here is that companies like this one are realizing that ESG has to be front and center and a core part of how they've developed this company from scratch. And therefore, everything that they do, all the decisions that are made are all viewed through this ESG lens. And therefore, it makes activities like fundraising and going to investors a heck of a lot easier, because right from the get-go, this company like Caribou is completely ESG compliant and friendly and does everything in exactly the right way. And so people are using this type of these factors of ESG almost as a design principle of how they develop companies. And this can lead to very successful fundraising in the future as they get through those types of rounds of investment. So it's time to do another little quiz here, just to get a better understanding from you as to whether in your organization, the key ESG driver, is it the consumer, is it regulatory, is it financial, or is it other? Just to get a quick view as to where people are coming from. Let's give it a few seconds and then we can close. So it's important that when you're considering ESG, you're considering it through all of these lenses, not just one of them, because yes, regulatory is important, but then so is the consumer, and consumer can lead to growth, whereas regulatory may just lead you to compliance. And of course, the financial factors, there's a very interesting example. There's a bank in, I believe it was Denmark, Danske Bank, I think. They are linking ESG to your interest rate. So if you're a company that is trying to borrow some funds for growing your business, they want to understand what is your associated ESG score. And based on your ESG score, they will give you a particular interest rate. And so this incentivizes you to be more green and to be more friendly. So it's interesting. So now we have the feedback from the quick poll here, and it seems that most of you, almost 50-50, are feeling that from the consumer side and the regulatory side, ESG is the primary driver here. So this is really good to know where this is coming from. In Europe, I think you're finding that this ESG is linked to the financial side much more, and in the US as well. So I'm curious to see how that works out over time. Now, this is all well and good, right? But now you're in your company. Who in your company should be driving ESG, right? And from where we see it, from the folks we've talked to and the work we've done out in the marketplace, the two key functions that are positioned to be at the forefront of ESG reporting and monitoring are supply chain and finance. Now, let's understand a little bit more as to why, okay? Well, when you look at supply chain, really, supply chain is at the heart of ESG. You have something like 95% of environmental impact of a company is through the supply chain, between retail, between telecommunications, automotive, other industries, across all of these areas. 95% comes from the supply chain, and the supply chain is in control of this 95% of the environmental impact. So this is squarely within the wheelhouse of the supply chain. The next is on the societal side. Almost 40% of people worldwide are occupied, are employed in some sort of a supply chain activity, whether it be the person in the warehouse, whether it be the person driving the truck, whether it's the person managing the factory, doing maintenance, what have you, or in retail. These people are engaged within the supply chain function, in the heart of the supply chain function. And then on the governance side, this is an interesting metric that something like last year, about $500 billion in market capitalization was wiped out because of supply chain related ESG governance issues. What do we mean by that? Well, think about examples that you might have heard about a big shoe manufacturing company who was hiring child labor or using unfair labor practices in some other country. Well, all this is coming to light now, right? As I said, the walls of the business are coming down or they're being rebuilt, but out of glass. And so everybody from outside can view in and wants to view in order to understand what you are truly doing and whether you are truly achieving these ESG initiatives and factors or not. And so you have companies like this. We had other examples of the fact that a big food manufacturer, their upstream, one of the vendor of a vendor upstream was using unfair labor practices as well. And again, that company got slammed and their stock price took a bit of a dive in light of this until they corrected it and okay, they brought it back on track. So here's where supply chain becomes front and center in front of this window of the world basically, and even things like like business waste is also coming under light right now. A company I worked for a few years ago, it was a big consumer goods company. They had something like $100 million spent in waste every year. And they had to do a lot to clean up that whole thing because it was not just waste in terms of cost being higher, but instead it was actually about the fact that having to get rid of all this product cost a lot of money and actually did a lot of harm to the environment and wasted a lot of sustainable resources. So supply chain is at the heart of ESG. And then finance are at the intersection of internal and external reporting and control. So if you think about audit, tax, compliance, investor relations, things like all of these factors, where do they reside? Yes, they might be different entities or different groups, but they all end up coming under finance and compliance and regulatory under that sort of umbrella. So this is where finance also needs to take a lead role because at the end of the day, they're managing relations with the investors and corporate relations. And so they're going to have to take a frontline view as to how these metrics are looking and be able to justify and give words to the qualifications that they're trying to put forth. So just to get a quick feedback from you, in your business, who is taking the lead on ESG as a part of your key initiatives? Is it the supply chain? Is it finance? And when I say finance, I mean the umbrella version of finance, which includes regulatory or compliance, audit, and investor relations. So let's pick one. And what we are seeing is that again, you have a situation where typically supply chain has been very inward looking and is now beginning to take the role that it needs to be more friendly to the external environment. As we said, companies like Unilever, Nike also are taking leads on this, and they're able to show, in fact, Starbucks is also a lead one in this, where they're able to show what type of fair trade world they're dealing with and what type of things they're doing in order to support the farmers in the different countries of the coffee beans. So what we see here is that finance is taking a lead role, and some of the other functions are taking a lead role as well. If you can just take a few seconds to write down in the Q&A in terms of which other functions might be taking a lead role, it would be interesting for us to understand that as well, so that we can develop other webinars that are more catered to those functions, so that we can understand the audience better as well. So thanks very much. You can take your time and then do it at your leisure in the Q&A box. That'll be great. Thanks. So let's go on to the measurement, right? So when you have initiatives, or when you have entire campaigns such as ESG and programs like ESG, you want to create, of course, the capability of reporting. Because that really is the foundation stone for everything you do. Because if you don't report, you're unable to monitor. If you're unable to monitor, it's very difficult to plan and act and make any changes within the organization. And so for the rest of this of the webinar, we're going to take a bit of a slant and focus a little bit more on the reporting, because that's one of the most pressing and urgent things that's needed out there as well. So starting with reporting, what we see is basically three key issues, right, are actually hindering the progress on ESG reporting. One is that there are many dimensions, right? What do we mean by that? Well, we'll come to that in a second. There's many frameworks, there's too many standards, there's many formats, there's no particular set way of doing this. And so there are many dimensions, because there's also a multitude of stakeholders. The second is that it's a very intensive effort that's required in order to report and monitor at any reasonable frequency. Today, most companies are trying to do things on an annual basis, because it just takes so much time, it takes so much effort, and so many man hours or people hours involved, that it's quite Herculean, and it's difficult to do it more on a real-time basis. And then the last is that we typically see within enterprises that they barely have a handle on the data that they own and that they have the rights over within their domain, let alone third-party sources and external sources and things that people are saying out there in the news and whatever else. It's very difficult to get multiple data sources and types together in some way that is robust and reliable. And so today you have third-party data which is of questionable provenance. And yes, I may look at your annual report, and my friend Jan may look at your annual report, and we might interpret the qualitative indicators in there in different ways. And so the interpretation is not standardized either. And so these are the three key things that are hindering the progress. Let me just give you a little bit of a deeper dive into each of these things. So for example, when you look at measurements, right? So you have companies like MSCI and Sustainalytics and others, Reuters, etc., who are doing this, and they're developing these scorecards or this type of rating schema for companies. And I just wanted to show you a quick example here of two that I pulled up from MSCI, and these are publicly available, by the way. And so we look at a company like Anheuser-Busch InBev, AB InBev, and we look at Unilever. And I think we have some people in the audience from both companies, so this should be fun. So when you look at AB InBev, it's given a rating of AA. So with MSCI ratings, it's like it's like bond ratings, where you go from AAA down to CCC, and AAA being the best, obviously. So when you look at AB InBev, it rates as a AA. And what they see is that it is a leader in the way that water stress is managed, but is in fact a laggard in terms of corporate behavior. Now you look at a company like Unilever on the right side, where it's rated as a single A, and they're leading in terms of corporate governance, they're leading in terms of the product carbon footprint, but they're laggards in terms of corporate behavior itself as well, rather. And MSCI goes into some detail as to what this means and all of that, right? So if you're using this type of rating schema, you'd say yes, you'd much rather put your money, behind AB InBev than Unilever. But if you look at Sustainalytics, for example, you look at the risk rating of AB InBev, and it's at it's actually a slightly higher level than Unilever. They're both regarded as medium risk. But when you look at the profile of risk, AB InBev is a slightly higher risk. Now, what does one do with this, right? If I'm trying to invest in these companies, if I'm trying to make some sort of decision about these companies, do I take the MSCI rating or do I take the Sustainalytics rating? And if you are either AB InBev or Unilever PLC, what data do you have to combat these types of ratings? What data can you bring to the table and say, no, guys, this risk rating is a different one than what you're trying to show here. And I have the ability to show you and manipulate these numbers in this way and that way and show you that what you're saying is actually not quite correct. And so here, what I'm trying to communicate is, either you measure it yourself or you get measured by somebody else. And if you get measured by somebody else, then you're going to be subject to this sort of black box logic that you may not have sufficient insight into. And if this is the type of black box logic that's going to determine what interest rate you get on your working capital for the next quarter or for the next year or what have you, or for some big sort of capital intensive initiative that you're trying to fund from outside through debt, well, then it should matter to you. And the more of this data that you can bring to the table yourself, and more of it that you can have the provenance that is reliable and honest and interpreted in the right way yourself, the better off you are going to be in the long run. Okay, so this talks about the in terms of the measurements and standards. Next, let's talk a little bit about the level of effort. So this was curious, and we had a little bit of a laugh about this. That in CFO magazine, it was recently published that the average annual budgeting cycle takes a median of 32 days. Now, this is 32 calendar days, right? So people working weekends, people working nights, and all of that good stuff. So you have 32 days for an annual budget. This is for a company you already know. These are the data sources that are already known. It's in a good format, the measurements are well defined, and it's to a limited number of stakeholders. So if this takes 32 days, then can you imagine what it would take in terms of reporting on ESG, where you have multiple units of geography? You might have if you're an enterprise like Danone or Nestle or whoever, you're working in all countries of the world in many different economic zones between Mercosur and EU and North America and whatever else. You're working through multiple zones, each of which have a disparate reporting requirement because these are not globalized yet. Then you have different rating schema. So if you're contributing numbers and analytics to the Sustainalytics and the MSCIs of the world, well, then you have to put it into those boxes as well and make sure you're complying with those kinds of metrics the way they want to report them and see them. And then the last point is that you have a dimension of stakeholder. So me as a consumer will want to see certain metrics, but maybe Jan as an investor might want to see other metrics, and Bobby in the bank might want to see a third metrics, and Lisa, who is a regulator, might want to see a different set of metrics. And so the idea is that you have to have your data scrunched up in all of these little units of analysis that can be assembled and aggregated and manipulated in diverse ways to be able to meet the profile of the dimension at the intersection of these three particular groupings that I've shown you. Okay, so the complexity of reporting is quite immense and shouldn't be taken lightly. To give you a bit more flavor on this thing, in terms of the data sources, this is what MSCI is looking at, right? So they've segregated it into company reported ESG information, the other information reported from other sources, third parties or what have you, and then company characteristics. So let's leave the gray one aside. Company characteristics are pretty objective about where you're based, et cetera, et cetera. But then let's look at the blue boxes, right? So they've already qualified as to, there are certain things that are more standard and certain things that are less standard. And when you see what is the most standardized, it's the governance disclosures that your company is making to the local authorities. Now, keep in mind, that's all fine, but if you have disclosures in more than one country or more than one economic zone, these different filings could be standard for those countries, but they might be very different from one country or one zone to another. And when you have global ratings like what MSCI is doing, you have to have some way to collate all this information together. Then there are some of the voluntary disclosures, things like even annual reports that might be a part of this. As I said, when I read an annual report, I might interpret things in one way, but somebody else might interpret it a different way. So these are less standard, and these are a bit more subject to qualitative assessment and measures. And then, of course, you have the last one, which is other non-standard ESG reporting frameworks where you're doing something quite unique or particular in one geography, which again nobody else is doing, but could be a competitive advantage to you. But because it doesn't fit nicely into any one of these ESG framework boxes, it might not be looked at. So again, it's up to you to share this in a standard manner so that your profile goes up, in the view of the world, and you are able to show in a demonstrable manner what kind of good things you are doing in terms of your performance and risk management and controversy management. Now, the worrisome box is the greenish one, where you have third-party information that's coming into the stream. Yes, people like MSCI have listed where they're getting data from, but in very general ways, not really exact sources, or what's the provenance, or how is it interpreted, or how often they're getting it, or who it's coming from, or if there's any truth testing that's been put on the back end to understand if it's rigorous or not, and what have you. And so this is a lot of the information here you need to manage yourself, because as I said, measure or be measured. And the more of this green information you can start collating yourself and collecting yourself, so that you're sure of the provenance and you're sure of reliability, the better off you will be in the long run. So we presented these three factors as sort of hindrances as to why reporting is not easy. What can we do about this, right? So number one is to have some sort of a flexible context-based handling mechanisms to allow dynamic reporting. So the more automated through things like robotic process automation that you might be able to handle these things, the collection of data might be more agile and done in a more batch approach, or more of a continuous approach. This is the type of thing that you need to start thinking about. Now, many of you here in the audience today, participants, are more on the functional side and not as much on the technical side. And so I want to explain it sort of in both languages, so that to make sure that we're understanding it. And then you can call upon your IT folks to say, hey guys, help me take care of this, and how do I move forward on this? On the second side, we have, a perpetual loop of passive data gathering mechanisms across your enterprise systems, as well as across external systems that you might be with your supplier, or with your customers, or with third-party logistics providers, or whoever else, rating agencies, or whatever. And then the last one is to create and manage new data sources, because on the data side, the world is not getting smaller, it's not shrinking, it's in fact expanding. And so you will need to deal with new data sources, new data types, and get them into your platform, and help have artificial intelligence or learning algorithms trained on this data, so that you can understand where should your focus lie. You can't focus on 50,000 data points, but you can focus on 20. And so use learning algorithms to understand which those 20 need to be, and help to monitor and predict what those need to be in the long term. So just to dive into this a little bit more, right? For folks who are going to be responsible for this, bit of an eye chart. Again, you'll be able to see this later. But this is from MSCI again. These are the different the key metrics that are being used for them. And as you see, it's not just around performance regarding ESG factors, but it's also about reporting on risk and reporting on controversy. And this is where things get a bit more messy, because frankly, as supply chain and finance, we've reported very well on performance. We know how to do this, but we haven't done typically as well on risk management and risk reporting rather, and controversy reporting. So let's put some more meat on the bone to this, and understand what do we really mean by this. So let's take an example around climate change, okay, as one of the columns on the metrics that MSCI is reporting on. So what you have is, within climate change, they're looking at a 3-year trend of your average performance scoring, in terms of emissions, right? And so when you have, so with metrics that you need to report like this, these are not unusual metrics. You're probably quite used to them already. You're probably reporting them within the four walls of your enterprise already. And here's an interesting example from Toshiba, where they've highlighted what their reporting framework looks like and what it includes actually. And you have something called Scope 1, 2, 3, and this is based on the greenhouse gas protocol, or GHG protocols as they're called. And the UK has been one of the first countries that's adopted this GHG protocol reporting mechanism, whereby the UK have said, if you're operating in the UK and if your revenues are over 2 million pounds a year, you need to mandatory have accounting and reporting of Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions by, I think it's by year end of this year. And what do we mean by this, right? So Scope 1 and 2 in the middle, in the box in the middle, you see this is the core operations of Toshiba. So this is about what emissions they're emitting through the fuel that they're consuming, through the industrial processes that they're implementing, and what is the profile of all the purchased energy that they have within the four walls of Toshiba. Well, they're also now including in Scope 3 upstream and downstream. So now if you're a chip manufacturer for Toshiba, or if you're a hard drive manufacturer for Toshiba, well, now you as Toshiba need to report on what is the carbon footprint of the drives that are being made at your supplier's site. You also need to be concerned about employee commuting. You also need to be concerned about business travel that's occurring, and the emissions due to the business travel that you might have for internal meetings and all that. You also need to provide information about the waste that's being generated in your upstream operation, as well as your transport and your delivery and your freight and shipment and warehousing and whatever else. So that's upstream. And then all the similar work has to happen downstream from the customer side. So if Toshiba is selling their computers and laptops at, say, Best Buy or at MediaMarkt here in Belgium, then they need to also support it with information about what is the greenhouse gas emissions in terms of transport and freight and distribution and what have you, and further downstream any manipulation of product that's happening, as well as end of life, right? What happens during your reverse logistics? What happens during the process of waste or use of unsold products or any of that? All of this has to be included as part of your reporting framework in this new world of ESG. So this is the easy part. This is performance. This you already know how to do for the most part. Now let's look at risk exposure and controversies. So imagine now you have, you need to have internal systems that you have to track down information around your own enterprise databases, whether it's your ERP system or your CRM system or what have you, as well as external data sources. So using web crawlers to go through the internet and find what other information you can find about your suppliers and your customers and whatever. And this will include structured data, unstructured data. You'll have to compare it against some sort of a value of a benchmark after you make sure that you truth test it to ensure that this data is reliable and it's of the right provenance. You'll probably need to start developing some artificial intelligence or learning codes and algorithms to predict what might be some future risks based on the profile of events that have occurred already. And then finding some sort of finding patterns in between these independent data sources and the measuring and monitoring systems or the mechanisms that use this logic. You might have to go through things like social networks or user-initiated sources, like, for example, Glassdoor, which is a website for recruitment, but employees or former employees can also report about working conditions at a particular company, and that's done off their own volition. And then, of course, linking things like IoT and sensors to other data sources. So we saw this great video about Port of Antwerp, who is also a client of Yuvo. They're using sniffing technologies in their ports to understand whether there are ships coming in or going out, or cargo containers that are emitting some sort of a scent of chemicals, or some sort of a profile of chemicals that are not good for the environment or are dangerous for the port or what have you. So they're actively using sniffing technologies like this and using other sensor technologies to be able to understand where the danger lies and where the risk is, and where should the border inspectors need to be, and where should the regulatory inspectors need to come to, and under what conditions. So these are the types of data that you need to sort of get your arms around. These are the types of profiles of information you need to wrap your arms around in order to manage your ESG risks and controversies as well. So time for a little bit of a survey again around in ESG reporting. Your organization is good at what? Is it performance reporting, risk reporting, controversy reporting, or none of the above? And you can choose all that apply. Okay. This becomes a very interesting thing for us to understand, because then you can start appreciating where you need to pay more attention to, what type of data and what type of processing logic you're going to need in order to deal with this type of information, on what frequency, and in what manner, in what basis, across what scope, and for which shareholders as well. Okay. So perhaps we can take a quick poll. So yes, so we are very good at performance reporting. So this is as we predicted. You're very good at this because you've been doing it for a long time. Risk reporting is also something most of you probably have a department that's handling corporate risk. But again, controversies, they always seem to catch us off guard. And really, this is one area we need to look at a little bit more as well. So thank you for sharing that. So what do we do about all of this now, right? I mean, this is all well and good. When we looked at a McKinsey survey that was done, what we found was that what is the hindrance to ESG adoption in terms of reporting, at least, right? And the two key things were the availability of data and the expertise to deal with this data and manage it. And when you have these two things, obviously the part in the middle, that the contributions to the value of ESG are not clearly seen if you don't have data available and if you don't know what to do with it, right? So these are the two things we're going to be taking into account when understanding what does it take to actually get there, right? So if you look at the things we talked about earlier, and we've just kind of consolidated them into little icons, into the spectrum of making data available towards knowing what to do with it. You have your multiple data sources, multiple data types, IoT data, transparency, and all of these things, right? We need to understand what better to do with it, and how do we actually get there. And so we designed this sort of a matrix to help you conceptualize what to do with all of this, and how to get a starting point on ESG reporting, or how to proceed further if you're already on the journey on the way there. And what we've basically mapped here is a 2x2 matrix, because obviously we're consultants, we love our 2x2s. On the bottom axis, we have making data available. So you have scarcity of data, and then wealth of data. And then on the y-axis, you have knowledge scarcity and knowledge abundance, or wealth. And basically, we will assume that you start at the basic ESG reporting, where you may not have too much knowledge, you may not have too much data, but you can definitely start there. And use your basic ESG reporting in order to manage ESG risk in a better way, right? And as you mature, it's much easier to mature along the data curve rather than the knowledge curve. So that's why the arrow goes towards the right first and says, okay, start collecting more data, start learning what to do with it, start building, different data sets, and start playing with it, right? And then invest in the knowledge to learn what to do with it, so that you can start using ESG as a growth lever and as a competitive lever, where you have more actionable and integrated ESG reporting into your daily cycles, into perhaps even your weekly or monthly sales and operations planning meetings, or integrated business planning meetings. You can start incorporating ESG metrics as part of your scorecard that you review each month. And so what does it take to get there? So we'll highlight 5 components of what it takes to get there. So we're saying build your ESG data strategy along these 5 lines. So these are the building blocks, if you will, right? So you want to have a catalog of ESG data. One thing to do is, obviously, you need to know what you have and what you don't have. You need to understand what stakeholder dimensions are you going to take into account. Are you going to deal with all 3 different types of stakeholders? Are you going to deal with one? What level of target ESG maturity are you looking for in this initial step? Are you looking for, just an incremental jump, or are you looking for some sort of quantum leap? And understand just to calibrate your goals and what you need to achieve and by when. Then what you want to do is to build an ESG data sandbox. So this incorporates not just data sets, but also different tools and different methods and approaches and knowledge and working with it and all of that. And then the last piece of it is creating an ESG community of practice. What do we mean by this? This is, ESG is not an IT problem. ESG is not a finance problem. It's not a supply chain problem. It's a business problem, right? And so you need to have people who are well-versed with all the underpinnings of this ESG data, whether it's supply chain risk, whether it's procurement, whether it's how we deal with regulators, whether it's how we deal with our growth with customers or recycling or whatever it is. You need to get those experts into the room. Could be internal people, a combination of internal and external, but you need to create this community of practice. And when you put these 2 things together, what you get is, what we're proposing is that you start off with creating your ESG data catalog, understand what's there and what you need, where are the holes. Then you start to create the stakeholder choices to understand what stakeholders do you want to deal with, what do you not want to deal with, what comes online before and offline after. Understand your target maturity level, build your data sandbox, right? As you start increasing your data set and start increasing the scope of what you're trying to do. And then finally, when you have your internal experts along with external experts, then you can start creating your ESG indicators in an actionable and an integrated manner. Okay, so this is sort of where it's at. It's a simple portrayal of a roadmap. The characterization is quite pragmatic, so that there's nothing crazy that's happening here. It's all quite manageable chunks, and of course we can help you along the way. And we suggest that you go through this type of a simple roadmap. So just to sort of round it all out, some concluding thoughts, just to recap. ESG is urgent and important. You're at the nexus of 3 critical factors: consumer, regulation, and financial markets. Reporting is the first order of business that you need to focus on. There are 3 key issues that you need to deal with: the dimensions, the level of effort, and the data sources that you need to wrap your arms around. ESG data strategy is definitely something that will be needed. It can build on your existing data strategy. It can be a tangent to it, or it can be some sort of complement to it, but you can certainly leverage whatever you've already gained inside your business. Embark on your ESG journey with a simple roadmap and start today. As you already said, you're already good at the performance bit, start with that. You can always work into the risk management and the controversy bit, but at least start with the performance bit. So with that, I just want to thank you for being here today. And Jan, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you, Deep. Thank you for introducing this topic to us, ESG, what can we do with it, and the important role of data. We got some questions, and we got also some information from the polls. Now, time is pretty short to answer them. Short after this webinar, we're going to record a session and send it to you to answer the questions that we received. So you will get a podcast with Deep and me going over the data and the questions. As usual, we also hope to see you again soon. We are planning to organize ESG deep dive sessions together with Deep in your organization. If you're interested, you can contact Deep and we can organize that. So there we will take into account the situation in your company, and we will look at the right way to work with ESG and data and to move on with that. Next to that, there's also a new webinar planned, a free lunch webinar at the 29th of April. And there we invite Port of Antwerp. Port of Antwerp will show us how they work towards a data-driven organization. So Danny van Dessel and Inge Lemmens will show the steps that they take to start from a non-data-driven business to now a data-driven organization, and all things that's come into the play field with that. That webinar will be in Dutch, and you can subscribe through our Eventbrite. So now I would like to thank Deep again for the presentation and for everything we learned about ESG. Thank you for your attention and have a great day, and hope to see you soon.